Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. The evening of the 19th of November, 1953. A cabin by the water, the fire going down. After dinner, someone opens a bottle of Cointreau and fills the glasses, and the men drink the way men do at the end of a long week. Frank Olson, 43, finishes his. He does not taste the second thing in the glass. There is nothing to taste. It was measured into the bottle hours before it reached the table. 20 minutes later, the room loosens at its edges. The voices slow and lengthen. Olson looks at his own hand as though it belongs to someone else. What he drank was an experiment. So is he. This is the case file of the program that filled his glass. The program was called MKUltra, and on paper, it was an answer to a fear. In the early 1950s, American prisoners came home from Korea changed. Some had confessed, on film, to crimes they had not committed. Some praised their captors in voices scraped clean of the men who once owned them. Washington had a word for it: brainwashing, and a conviction that the Soviets had learned to reach inside a human being and move the furniture. The CIA decided it would learn the trick first. In April 1953, its director, Alan Dulles, approved the search and handed it to a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, a quiet man with a clubfoot and a farm in Virginia, who would spend the next 20 years looking for the lever that opens a mind. He was given money without limit and oversight without teeth. Under him, MKUltra branched into at least 150 experiments across some 80 hospitals, prisons, and universities, the agency's hand hidden behind charities that existed only on paper. The method never changed. Find a person, give them something, and watch what breaks. Before any of it could work, they had to learn to give a man a drug without his knowing. Gottlieb hired a stage magician for that, John Mulholland, paid to write a manual on sleight of hand. How to slip a powder into a drink, a pill into a meal, unseen. In New York, and later San Francisco, the agency rented ordinary apartments and dressed them as places for sex. A federal narcotics agent named George Hunter White ran them. He hired prostitutes to work the bars and bring men back. Salesmen, dock workers, strangers with no part in any of this. And the drinks those men were handed were laced with LSD. Behind a one-way mirror, White sat with a jug of martinis and a notebook and watched them come apart. What the agency wanted to know was whether a drug, slipped to a man who had no idea he had taken it, could loosen his guard enough to make him talk. The men were chosen for their silence. Ashamed of where they had been, they were unlikely to tell anyone what had happened there, and they were never told themselves. The operation was called Midnight Climax. In a federal hospital in Kentucky, the subjects could not walk out at all. They were addicts and inmates, and a doctor named Harris Isbell paid them in the one currency they could not refuse, the drug they were already dependent on. Isbell had nearly 800 compounds shipped to him from Washington. In one experiment, 7 men, all of them black, were given LSD every day for 77 days without a break. The dose raised higher as their bodies learned to bear it. And the program reached past its own borders. In Montreal, with CIA money moving through a paper charity, a respected psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron took ordinary patients, people who had come to him for anxiety, for low spirits after childbirth, and set about erasing them. He called it de-patterning. He put them into drugged sleep for weeks, drove their minds down with electroshock given several times a day, then played a single recorded sentence into their ears for as long as 16 hours at a stretch, hundreds of thousands of times, trying to raise a new self on the ground he had cleared. Some never found their way back to the people they had been. How many moved through all of it? The apartments, the wards, the asylums? No one can say. The records that would have counted them were never meant for reading and would not survive. That was the program. And then there was the man at the lake. Frank Olson was no stranger lured from a bar, no patient with nobody to ask after him. He was one of the agency's own, which is the only reason his name reaches us at all. His trouble had begun long before the Cointreau. He had spent years at Fort Detrick among the cages where weapons were tried on animals, and he had stood in CIA rooms in Europe where men were questioned under drugs. Slowly, he had started to want out. That wish was the reason for the glass. The dose at Deep Creek Lake was a test. To learn whether a man who carried the agency's secrets and meant to leave with them could still be trusted to keep them. The drug did not loosen Olson. It unmade him. He stopped sleeping. He told his wife, Alice, that he had made a terrible mistake and could not say what it was. He asked to be let go. A man who handled biological weapons, suddenly broken and asking to walk away, was no longer a colleague to them. He was a risk. They sent him to New York with a handler, to a doctor the agency kept for such cases, and on the 9th night after the lake, he went through a high window onto 7th Avenue. He was 43. The death was filed as a fall, then as suicide. His wife and children were told he had cracked under the strain of his work. Nothing of the lake, the glass, or the program that had poured it. For 22 years, that was all they were allowed to know. For all of it, the program produced nothing. That is the part most easily lost beneath the strangeness of the details. After 20 years and uncounted subjects, MKUltra never found the lever it was built to find. There was no drug that turned a person into an instrument, no sentence that could be played into a skull until a new man answered to it. And the search had not been narrow. LSD was simply the one they trusted most. The program ran through many other drugs besides, and reached past drugs entirely, into hypnosis, electroshock, and sensory deprivation. Every door it could find into a person, and none of them opened. The thing Washington feared was real, but it was never chemical. The prisoners in Korea had not been rewired. They had been worn down, isolated, exhausted, frightened, and held that way until they said what was wanted. It is an old method, and it needs no laboratory. What MKUltra had in place of results was permission. It lived inside the agency's technical staff, paid for through fronts, answerable to a few men who had agreed not to ask. There was no consent to gather, no board to satisfy, no subject who would ever see a file. A program built that way cannot correct itself, because nothing it does ever has to be explained. The agency would later admit as much about its own work, that the testing had produced little of value, and that the men running it were in no position to judge what they saw. By then, it hardly mattered. The point had never really been knowledge. It was reach, how far the agency could go inside a private human being, and how little it would have to answer for once it was done. So the program produced what its method guaranteed. A drug given to someone who has not agreed to take it does not hand you their secrets. It hands you a casualty, a stranger who will not be believed, an addict already past complaint, a patient who will never find the words again, and once a chemist in a hotel room with a name and a family, and a handler who would not call for help until he had first made a call of his own. In the winter of 1973, the program ended as it had lived, without witnesses. Richard Helms, the departing director of the agency, ordered the files destroyed, and Gottlieb, on his way out, saw it done. 20 years of experiments on human beings went to the incinerator. It should have ended there, unrecorded. What undid the secret was not the agency, but a newspaper. In December 1974, the reporter Seymour Hersh laid out, on the front page of the New York Times, that the agency had spent years running illegal operations against Americans inside the United States, in plain breach of its charter. The story said nothing about MKUltra. Hirsch was describing the agency's illegal surveillance at home. The drug program was not part of it, and almost no one outside the agency knew it existed. What the story did was force an inquiry. In 1975, the Senate's Church Committee and a presidential commission began turning the agency inside out. And it was there, in the digging, not in the headline, that MKUltra first came up. They were 2 years too late. The files were ash, the men were gone, and what they could reconstruct was an outline without a body. One thread survived. Buried in the Commission's report were 2 paragraphs about an unnamed army scientist given LSD without his knowledge, dead in a fall in 1953. The Olson family read them and understood at last what had been done to Frank. In 1975, the family was received at the White House, where President Ford apologized for a death the government had hidden for 22 years. A year later, in 1976, Congress paid them $750,000, and Ford signed an order forbidding drug experiments on people who had not agreed to them. In 1977, a single records request turned up what the fire had missed: roughly 20,000 surviving documents, financial paperwork misfiled in the wrong building. It is the largest piece of the program anyone still has. No one was prosecuted. The agency burned the record before anyone could read it, and what survived by accident. So the full account was not lost, but destroyed on purpose, by the only people who could have told it. One question for the comments: when the records are gone, can a thing like this ever be known, or only suspected? The next case on this channel is Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman granted a medical degree, accepted at first as a joke. This is the sealed ward